What is up, everybody? Welcome back to the Tomatito Boxing Show. It's been a minute since I've been here, since I've been able to sit behind the microphone on this end and record between work and several obligations that have gotten in the way. I think we're already about 3 weeks, maybe even a month since the last episode. I believe it's been a month already. Last episode was in the lead up to the big Canelo Alvarez Edgar Berlanga fight, or at least a big expectation for Canelo Alvarez that weekend and his big festive Mexican festive weekend, which is Mexican Independence Weekend. And then from there, the following week, Jaime Munguia, Eric Bazinian out in the Phoenix area. I got to travel out there. And those of you that keep up with the channel, well, you got to see some of those interviews that I got. I actually got to talk to Jaime Munguia real brief after the weigh-ins. And since then, schedule and life has just taken me elsewhere and kept me away from being able to talk to you guys about the sport that we love and that we follow so closely. But it doesn't mean I've been completely checked out. And so listen, what we got is a lot of boxing. We got a lot to talk about. And so let's, before we take the trip and recap, let's go with the most recent fight, which was the biggest fight that we were expecting, the biggest fight that we were waiting for quite some time, and it just kept getting away from us. It seemed like it was something that was not going to happen. This is a fight that was supposed to happen a few months back, and ARTUR Beterbiev ends up getting injured with having knee surgery, and the fight is called off, and then it gets delayed, and it was one of those fights that we've been clamoring for so long, and it finally happened just a few days back. Now that we've been able to allow everything to sink in, I've been able to keep up with some post-fight interviews, as well as a lot of commentary going back and forth with other big names within the sport, and how they've gauged this. But we definitely want to jump into it because this was an important fight. It was a necessary fight, and I'm glad it happened. And I want to know what you guys think because I'm really happy that the fight delivered. In my opinion, we've seen such big fights in the past with all the buildup, all the hype, promotionally, fanatically speaking. They've had such big buildup to them, and then they end up under-delivering, being subpar. But more so than not, we end up seeing our heads end up playing games with us where we end up believing the fight's going to go one way, and it completely ends up being a one-sided fight. It ends up being a dull fight, or it ends in controversy because of a referee or some type of foul, or judges usually end up killing the night. This was some of what happened with this fight between Dmitry Bivol and ARTUR Beterbiev, where one judge ends up taking a lot of the criticism because of the wide decision that he gave, a little bit wider than the other ones. But I'm really curious to see how you guys had it. And if this fight would have been called a draw, I wouldn't have been upset with it. But now we all know that ARTUR Beterbiev got the best of Dmitry Bivol. By way of decision, he ends up having his hand raised after the fight and is now the undisputed king at light heavyweight at 175 pounds. All the belts lie with his one man, ARTUR Beterbiev. This is the first time that he made it to a decision. That's impressive in itself. Two undefeated fighters who left it all out in the ring. And it was as tight a fight as you could have imagined. If you didn't see it, go watch it. Dmitry Bivol stepped into the ring with a 23-0 record, 12 knockouts to his credit. Former teammate of ARTUR Beterbiev in the amateurs. And with his biggest wins being over Joe Smith Jr., Jean Pascal, Zurdo Ramirez, and Juan Canelo Alvarez. Maybe even an older Sullivan Barrera, who in his heyday got to compete against Andre Ward, if I remember correctly. And then we had Artur Beterbiev on the other corner, who stepped in with the perfect 20-0 record with 20 knockouts. Every single opponent he had stopped, 100% knockout ratio, unblemished record, and 3 titles accompanying him into the ring. His biggest wins: were more of the more recent fights that he had. Alexander Vozdik, whom he dethroned to lift the WBC title from him, defeated Marcus Brown, Joe Smith Jr. as well, Anthony Yarde, Callum Smith. Both really experienced, well-versed fighters with 2 completely opposite styles. A heavy-handed, heavy-hitting Artur Beterbiev, who's able to dominate the fights by way of his power, who's able to smother his opponents and push the action forward, versus the intrigue of how Dimitri Bivol would answer this as the more versed boxer, with better footwork, faster hands, and volume definitely lied with Dimitri Bivol. That was exactly how the fight played out. Dimitri Bivol throwing combinations on multiple occasions, throwing 5, 6, 7 punch combinations to where Beterbiev would not answer, but later press on with his power. Round 1, I gave it to Dimitri Bivol. Round 2, Artur Beterbiev. Round 3 and 4, Dimitri Bivol. Round 5, 6, 7, and 8, I gave to Artur Beterbiev. Round 9 and 10, I gave to Dimitri Bivol. Round 11 and 12 to Artur Beterbiev. 115, 113 for Artur Beterbiev. Meaning, by the start of round 11, I basically had this as a toss-up. By the start of round 12, Artur Beterbiev pretty much did all the work in that closing round. Now let's look at where the dispute happens. Dimitri Bivol visibly threw more punches. I'm talking visibly. It just looked like he was pressing the action. He was controlling the action. He had the most volume. And so when you would see this, it definitely caught your eye that Dimitri Bivol was putting better punches together, was putting the volume amount of punches together, was circling the ring, was making it into a boxing fight. But it was very evident that he had to fight on his back foot for a long portion of the fight and for the majority of the fight because Beterbiev's power was something to contend with. It was no joke. And whenever Beterbiev would come in and land 1 or 2 punches, yes, he was already outthrown, but those 1 or 2 punches were more damaging and were pushing Bivol back to where he was often finding himself against the ropes with his glove up, full guard, and on the defensive. In my opinion, I saw Bivol boxing better than Beterbiev, putting a multitude of punches together. But Beterbiev switching the pressure and the flow of the fight to his favor with his power. he would land one uppercut and send Bivol back, to where Bivol would start strong at the beginning of the round, maybe the first minute and a half, and then Beterbiev would dominate from there. Just start walking forward. When they would have these crazy exchanges of punches where Bivol would get the best of them in the center of the ring, Beterbiev was eating through these punches, walking past the punches and lunge forward, landing power of his own, which would end up finding Bivol on his back foot. And this was the story throughout the night. A lot of people started claiming robbery. A lot of people claimed that Bivol won this fight single-handedly, that by landslide. That's not true. Again, I'll go back to the beginning of the episode. If this fight would have been called a draw, it was that tight of a fight, and there were many swing rounds. I just gave you 4 rounds from 6 to 10 that I gave to Beterbiev. Sorry, round 5, 6, 7, and 8 that I gave to Beterbiev. Many of those were close, but many of those ended up swinging my opinion towards Beterbiev because of the way that he was closing out the rounds. He would get the onslaught of Bivol in sporadic flows, and then he would end up pressing the action forward and keeping Bivol with his guard up and just hurting Bivol to the body and to the head. There was no controversy there, in my opinion. I scored it for Beterbiev. Beterbiev gets his hand raised. People start backpedaling. I'm okay with it. I stand with it. People could tell me I'm wrong. I stand with it. Of course, this is a channel by a fan for the fans. And this is how I happen to see it. And that's why I encourage you guys to leave me comments and talk to me about these fights, because I want to see what your point of view was. What was it that you saw, if you saw something different than how I saw it? I saw Bivol with the higher volume without even consulting CompuBox. Just visibly speaking, I would see Bivol putting 5, 6, 7 punches together. Sometimes I think I saw him throw about 8 or 9 punches together. Not all of them landed cleanly, but it was almost like from a flow of pressing the action to a suppressive fire type flow of punches that he would put together, punching his way out into a reset so he could gather himself. He was so aware of Beterbiev's power that he would initiate his action, 1, 2, 3 punches, 4 punches, and then punch his way out into clear, into a reset. Punch his way out of danger. And those punches is where Beterbiev would end up catching him as he would lunge forward, walk through those punches, and land something of note. Now we consult CompuBox. If we consult CompuBox, total punches, Beterbiev landed 137 out of 682, giving him a 20.1% accuracy rate. 137 of 682. 31 of those 137 were body punches. Dmitry Bivol, remember, I just said visibly how he would throw 6, 7, 8 punches in a row. By CompuBox, he ended up throwing 142 out of 423. Beterbiev threw nearly 260 more punches than Bivol and landed 5 less than Bivol. Dmitry Bivol's percentage was at 33.6 in accuracy. 31 punches of those 142 landed to the body for Dmitry. So they landed identical numbers to the body on each other. 137 Beterbiev overall, 142 Dmitry Bivol. Beterbiev actually outthrew Dmitry Bivol, yet my eyes were perceiving that Dimitri Bivol had the more volume in as far as punching was concerned, because of the amount of punches that he would throw in these successions. Yet Dimitri Bivol outthrew nearly 260 more punches than Dimitri Bivol. As far as jabs are concerned, 58 for Dimitri Bivol, 12 to the body of those 58. 47 by Beterbiev, 8 of them to the body of those 47. Power punches, 90 by Beterbiev, 84 by Bivol. 19 of those to the body power punches, 23 of those power punches of the 90 that Beterbiev threw landed on Bivol's body. The story is that Bivol connected on 50% of his power punches, while Beterbiev only landed 29% of his. Bivol landed 33 power punches over the first 6 rounds, while Beterbiev landed 23. Beterbiev lands 67 power punches to Bivol's 51 in the second half of the fight. In the last 2 rounds of the championship rounds, 11 and 12, Beterbiev lands 29 power punches, while Bivol landed 19. Both of them had a margin of approximately 4 punches that separated the two between rounds 8 through 12. The judges' scorecards: 2 score it 115-113, and 1 scored it 116-112. And that's the scorecard that garnered a lot of attention. I scored it 115-113 for Beterbiev, and it was those last 2 rounds that ended up giving him that win, in my opinion. Otherwise, it was a really tight fight. So I wasn't too far off to the way that the judges were scoring. If anything, it was right spot on, 115-113. That 116-112 is the one that garnered a lot of attention. We now turn to a lot of the big names, like Tim Bradley walking back saying he had Beterbiev live on television, and then says he rewatched the fight a day later and now he had it for Bivol. And then other channels saying Bivol should have won, this was a robbery. People saying that Turki Al-Sheikh felt the same way, that this was a robbery, that Bivol should have won, and all this nonsense that's going on, which Andre Ward getting on Bivol's case, saying that you should never admit that you lost, and you should never concede a loss in the manner in which he did, very respectfully. And I agree with Dimitri Bivol, where he said respectfully in the ring, hey, it's the judge's opinion and didn't go my way, and it sucks that he lost. He obviously didn't want to lose. He felt he did enough to have won, but congratulated ARTUR Beterbiev. A gentleman, Andre Ward, comes out and says you should never concede a loss so you could build up the rematch. Maybe some promotional tactics there, but I think Dimitri Bivol was in the right. Very gracious in defeat, and he's been very humble as a victor. Bivol comes out the day after, several interviews that he gave, one of them where he ends up actually acknowledging that ARTUR Beterbiev's punching power is definitely something to contend with, but he also acknowledged that Canelo Alvarez punches hard, but punches less than ARTUR Beterbiev. Beterbiev damages you because of accumulation of punches and a higher volume, higher output than what Canelo Alvarez possesses, but acknowledged that Canelo Alvarez does have a good punch, a very strong punch that can hurt you by doing less. So he gave Canelo his props. Maybe he's trying to find a way into that rematch and another big payday with Canelo, now that he doesn't have a title. But now Canelo doesn't really need Bivol other than to right the wrong in his resume. He doesn't really need Bivol because there's no title there. David Benavidez has now signed a fight with David Morrell, 2 former 168-pounders who got tired of waiting for Canelo Alvarez and the sweepstakes. They move up to 175. David Morrell was successful in his debut, and David Benavidez successful against Vosdik in his respective debut at 175. He picked up the interim WBC title and is knocking on the door, is next in line, should he be victorious over David Morrell, to fight and challenge ARTUR Beterbiev for all the belts. That fight between Morrell and Benavidez seems to be signed for January of 2025. The ideal thing would be that these two would rematch. It was such a clean fight, such a great fight, such a great showing for both of these fighters that it left you wanting more. And it was such an evenly contested fight that you definitely want to see how these two fighters would fare against one another, having 12 rounds under their belts against one another. Having seen what the other brings to the table, how will they formulate their next camp if there was to be a rematch? ARTUR Beterbiev, in his post-fight interview, said he's very critical of himself, especially as he continues to fix his skill set and continues to develop his boxing skills, but does so after being used to knocking out and stopping his opposition. This kind of disturbed him a little bit, or it bothered him. It's kind of a chip on his shoulder now that he says he wasn't able to get the knockout. And he was somewhat disappointed with his performance because he ended up going all the way to where it was left on the fence and left on the hands of the judges when he's traditionally the one that is the judge, jury, and executioner of his own fate in that squared circle. Very, very intriguing fight. I'm glad it happened. I want to know what you guys think about the fight, and if you were disappointed or if you were happy, if you enjoyed it, and what you think about all the stuff that followed afterwards. The card. Listen, these Riyadh season cards, in my opinion, they're putting together some really intriguing, some really fan-favorite fights, fan-friendly style fights, but the cards are just taking way too long. I don't care about the concerts, just my opinion. I don't care about these concerts. I don't care about all the fanfare. It took nearly an hour and 15, hour 20 minutes between fights, between the Fabio Worley and Frazier Clark fight and the start of Beterbiev Bivol. It was pretty tiring, a lot of buildup, a lot of talking, and it kills your evening because it keeps you tuned in, wanting to watch that fight, and you're stuck because you know you're invested into watching this fight, but it just doesn't come soon enough. And but it's a new flow. And listen, maybe it's just a change that we're complaining about. Maybe it's just because it's something different, a different approach. A lot of people like it, and I respect that as well. It's just not my cup of tea. And maybe it's just because I'm a little bit biased because I'm used to just the different flow of the HBO platform, having grown up with that, or the Showtime platform, and the style of how they conduct these big events and the pay-per-views and so forth. I'm used to a different flow, per se. So congrats, ARTUR Beterbiev is the new undisputed king at 175 pounds. This fight finally took place, and I'm excited about it. And if there's a rematch, you bet your ass I want to be tuned in and watching at the edge of my seat, because now I'm even more intrigued if there is a rematch to see how they adapt and what game plan they end up bringing to the table. No, there's absolutely nothing that you could tell me that Dmitry Bivol did wrong. He put on a near flawless performance that had to deal with the hammer-like power, sledgehammer-like power that ARTUR Beterbiev possesses with both hands. He boxed, he moved, he jabbed, mixed up his punches very well, had really good output, really good volume, would pick up the pace when need be, would end up taking breaks when needed, listened to his corner, communicated well with his corner. It was a near flawless performance by Dmitry Bivol, and it still wasn't enough for him to get his hand raised. It went to the judges. I agree. that the judges ended up deeming this a decision. He didn't get knocked out. Therefore, that's a positive that leads us to believe that there may be something else that Bivol could bring to the table in the rematch, or with different judges that they would end up rendering a decision for Bivol, and now we would be facing a potential trilogy. But for that to happen, of course, we need these two guys to run it back. Both very willing to do so. ARTUR Beterbiev is just a force to be reckoned with. And he boxes very well himself. He puts punches together very well himself. And it almost looks like he's pitter-patting, yet he's damaging his opponent. And it's very evident by his body of work. And it was very evident on this fight last Saturday, just looking at the markings on Dmitry Bivol's face. So all hail undisputed King ARTUR Beterbiev, who is the undisputed champion at 175 pounds at the light heavyweight division. And I can't wait to see what comes next for him. More than likely, both of these guys sit out the rest of the year. We're already mid-October, and they'll be tuned in to see what David Benavidez brings to the table, should he be victorious over the Cuban sensation that is David Morrell in January. To round out the event, Jaio Pitaya remains perfect. Stops Jack Massey in the 6th round. A game Jack Massey at that. IBF Cruiserweight champ is now going to sit and watch mid-November as Zurdo Ramirez is going to be facing Chris Billam-Smith out in Saudi Arabia themselves as well, as Golden Boy has put together a card called Latino Heat or Latino Night, something like that. And that's going to be a big card as well for Golden Boy, where he gets to showcase a lot of his talent on that very card. And Zurdo Ramirez headlining against Chris Billam-Smith in a big cruiserweight unification bout. Chris Eubank Jr., the IBO champion at middleweight now that he dethroned Kamil Szeremeta, or defeated Kamil Szeremeta. Former opponent of Gennady Golovkin, former opponent of Jaime Munguia. Those are the two biggest opponents and two biggest fights that Kamil Szeremeta had in his resume, and he lost both of those. Subpar opponent who doesn't bring much to the table. Chris Eubank looked great because he was damaging the body of Kamil Szeremeta, dropped them multiple times until eventually it led to a stoppage. Chris Eubank Jr. is now an IBO champion at middleweight, which is the lesser known of the titles. But you got a pretty decent level of opposition at middleweight, where you have Hamza Shiraz, who's looking to be one of the strongest possible foes and prospects or contenders in that division. You have Janibek, who's still the unified champ, calling for the other two champions, Carlos Adames and Erislandy Lara. Janibek by far the strongest of the opponents and the unified champ at middleweight. And in a fight with Hamza Shiraz would be absolutely amazing. If Janibek gets a fight with Chris Eubank Jr., I think Janibek is favored to win that fight. If Janibek is able to get into the ring against Carlos Adames or Erislandy Lara, which is less likely, who was just successful recently against Danny Garcia on the undercard of Canelo Alvarez to retain that WBA title, I think that's easy pickings for Janibek. Chris Eubank Jr. now has a minority title around his waist, but champion nonetheless, and which gives him a little bit of leverage, plus the name, to get himself into a bigger showdown. He says he's going to be fighting Canelo Alvarez next year. Everybody wants those sweepstakes. I think he should go after Erislandy Lara and maybe get one of the major titles at 160 and then try to unify that division. His chances are going to stand a lot better. He's wasted a lot of time in his career, but nonetheless, now it looks like rather than a title fight, he's going to be fighting the fight that got away from him and that got away from the fans from a couple years back against Conor Benn. Conor Benn steps in the ring. You had soccer star Neymar, who was in there trying to mediate the action and just basically promotional type thing that they had, a back and forth and exchanging barbs with one another. But it looks like we're going to get Conor Benn and Chris Eubank Jr. Finally in the ring against one another coming 2025. Fabio Wardley was the fight that really got the attention of the fans, got everybody off their seats. The 13 rounds between Frazier Clark and Fabio Wardley. If you remember that fight, big heavyweight fight that left us all wanting more, that took place earlier this year. Fabio Wardley and Frazier Clark fought to a draw back in March of this year. Everybody wanted to see more of this. It was an action-packed fight. And Fabio Wardley ends up knocking out Frazier Clark with arguably the hardest punch that Frazier Clark has ever been hit with. And he said so himself. Frazier Clark said that this is the hardest punch he's been hit with. He got knocked out. His jaw is broken in 3 places, as it was reported, and he was wired shut the next day as they try to hold interviews with him. He is okay. He's going to bounce back, but he's going to be on the mend for quite a while. And Fabio Wardley has put him out. Has dominated Frazier Clark. Who knows if these guys will ever run it back, but there's nothing else that is left between these two to be unsolved. Fabio Wardley ended this rivalry in emphatic fashion, and what a knockout. What a sensational knockout that he came away with. Ben Whittaker, Liam Cameron. Ben Whittaker trying to establish himself as a who's who at light heavyweight as well. Has fame from the Olympics and is known as doing the drunken master type boxing in there and his antics. Well, he fights a Liam Cameron who's a journeyman fighter himself, very experienced, and Liam Cameron was actually giving trouble to Ben Whittaker and would potentially have beaten Ben Whittaker as he was beating him to the punch, hurting him to the body. They eventually end up clinching. They go over the ropes. Ben Whittaker ends up saying that he injured his foot. The fight is brought to an end, and that was all she wrote. We never got to see the end of this fight, and it was considered a draw, technical decision draw. And then last but not least, in the women's division, Skye Nicholson won a unanimous decision over Raven Chapman, giving Raven Chapman the first defeat of her career. Skye Nicholson remains undefeated, 12-0 now as the WBC featherweight champ, women's featherweight champ, looking to get into a potential showdown with Amanda Serrano down the line. So again, Fabio Wardley, that's a heavyweight division. We're going to talk about the heavyweight division here, as is one of the episodes that we missed here in the past weeks between Joshua and Dubois. We're going to touch base on that and the entire heavyweight division, as we will go back and revisit where we last left off. The super middleweights, Canelo Alvarez, Edgar Berlanga, Jaime Munguia, the super middleweights that were in full-fledged action within a span of 2 months. But for now, this is the one that we focused on. Undisputed King Artur Beterbiev gets his hand raised, gets all the belts, and is now going to sit and wait to see what happens with his mandatory challenger, David Benavidez. That's another big payday for Artur Beterbiev. And if David Benavidez is successful over David Morrell, that fight should happen in 2025 if they don't negotiate an immediate rematch between him and Dmitry Bivol to be able to run back the great fight that we just witnessed a few days back this past weekend. So I'll leave you guys with that. We're back in motion. We're back going strong, and I can't wait. We got plenty of boxing to talk about. And it was a big weekend for boxing as well. Japan had a 2-day festival of fights. We're going to go ahead and touch base on that as well, and on the coming episodes. And we're going to get caught up, and we're going to get going. And we got a big weekend coming up as well, or a decent weekend of boxing coming up as well. Here in a few days' time. So I'm glad to be back. I'm glad to be sitting on this end, and thank you guys again for all the love, the support, and for continuing to tune in and spread the word about the show. And here we go. Get ready. We got plenty of boxing to talk about and to cover, and I can't wait to bring you those episodes here in the coming days. Take care of yourself. Have a great night. Stay safe, and I'll catch you guys all on the next episode. Take care.